Hi folks, and welcome to episode 35 of the Epochs of the Load Seaters. I'm joined by Bo, and today we're going to be discussing the mythical founder of Athens, Theseus. Great Greek hero, slayer of minotaurs and other bandits.
Anyone else who gets in his way.
Yeah, basically, yeah. And we have a Life of Theseus by Plutarch that we'll be going through. And honestly, I feel kind of bad for Plutarch about it because it's obviously all nonsense and it's obviously totally mythological. And Plutarch does a very good job in every other respect of being very diligent about like collecting sources and, you know, cross-referencing them, being like, well, some people say this, some people say that, I think most likely that. And he generally is very historical in the things in his lives. And you can't do that with Theseus because it's all nonsense. It's all myth. But it is a fun myth, and so we thought we'd go through it. So, so to begin, one thing that Plutarch notes is that the Athenians are collected as a people in the Iliad and in Homer's collection of the ships in the Iliad. So Theseus is set pre-Trojan War.
Well, I mean, it's all up for debate. One of the things that scholars say is that it's the chronology of Theseus is hopelessly confused.
Yes, that's definitely true.
Yeah, he's much more myth than man, than historical figure.
Absolutely.
I mean, but I wouldn't say he's entirely fictional. I mean, it does say, for example...
I would.
well, one of the things Plutarch says is that in Athens there was a tomb. That doesn't necessarily mean anything, but there was a tomb of Theseus.
Yeah.
I think the Athenians thought that he was real.
Which
doesn't mean he was at all. But
I was going to say, you know, that doesn't mean much because they thought all of these people were real.
Right.
And so it's like, okay, I mean, sure, they did think he was real. And I'm not saying he didn't have a certain kind of reality because of that, but I think that Theseus is obviously not a real person.
He's much more of an archetype,
Yes.
isn't he? And the episodes, the stories, the individual stories in his life are quite often, they're clearly allegorical or symbolic or whatever you want to say.
Are you saying he didn't really fight centaurs?
Well, no biologist or zoologist has ever described a centaur.
What about minotaurs?
Or minotaurs, yeah. But I guess we'll get into it. Sorry, go on.
But the point that the Plutarch was trying to make, I think, is just that, you know, Theseus happened a very long time ago, even before the Trojan War, apparently. Whether this is correct or not, I don't know. Again, I feel bad for Plutarch because he's trying to draw logical conclusions from things that are obviously just fairy tales. And so, but anyway.
He very much wants to try and paint him as a real historical figure.
Yes.
So, for example, one of the famous stories, other than the Minotaur, is that he goes to Hades to try and abduct Persephone.
Yes.
And that's like a really famous episode in the life of Theseus. And Plutarch doesn't talk about that. He mentions Cerberus as though it's a real guard dog in some other situation.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, he's definitely trying to make him a real person.
Yes. Because Plutarch's drawing a parallel with his life and Romulus.
That's right, yes.
So, and Romulus probably more likely to be real than Theseus, although...
I think of them much in the same boat sort of thing, really.
They are.
I mean, some people argue that you can make an argument that even figures in the Alexandrian age might not be real, or that the accounts are not trustworthy enough to say he's definitely a historical figure.
I hear these arguments, but the thing is, nothing ascribed to someone like Alexander is really mythical, to be honest. You know, like what's he? He didn't fight Amazons or kill Cyclopses or something. You know, he attacked the Persian Empire, which is a real thing.
Well, for example, there's the Phrygian Knot.
Or the Gordian Knot.
Sorry, the Gordian Knot, which takes place in Phrygia. Sorry, yeah, the Gordian Knot.
But that's not even a mythological story. What happened? He couldn't untie the knot, so he cut through it with his sword. Well, that could happen.
Yeah, it could totally happen, for sure.
It's such a very realistic sounding mythological story, in fact. You know, so like, this is the thing, isn't it? You know, like... I'm much more inclined to believe stories about Socrates and Alexander than I am about Theseus.
Sure, no, absolutely. And as you mentioned, Plutarch's lives, he pairs two people together usually. Quite often when you buy a sort of a penguin paperback version of Plutarch, they will have edited it in different ways.
Yeah.
But originally he was comparing two people. So for example, the most famous one is Alexander and Augustus he pairs together. And in this case, it's Theseus and Romulus. So both sort of founding figures of their various states.
Great cities.
Yeah, so Theseus is known as, he's not the first king of Athens remotely. I mean, his father was the 9th king, so he would be the 10th king. However, it is sort of lost in the mists of time, and as I mentioned earlier, the chronology is hopelessly confused. So, for example, he's supposed to have been contemporary with Hercules.
Yeah, and jealous of Hercules as well.
Well, in many ways, Theseus is a specifically Athenian version of Hercules, and we'll get into all the parallels there.
Yeah.
But Hercules is supposed to predate Troy, and yet Theseus is also involved in the abduction, kidnap of Helen.
Yeah.
And he's involved with King Minos of Crete, of course, with the Minotaur. And that's a few generations before Hercules. So how can he exist in all these things? And maybe he was involved in the Jason and the Argo.
Yeah, well,
so it's it doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
He's supposed. The chronology doesn't make any sense.
It's something that's clearly been made up after the fact by the Athenians to try and sound important.
Yeah. So that's the other thing. We're going to talk really mainly about Plutarch's version.
Yeah.
But the thing to realise is that Plutarch's writing in the 1st century AD into the 2nd century AD, sometime around then, around the year 100, roughly, AD. But the classical Athenians, it seems, they wrote loads of different types of literature and poems and plays all about him.
Yeah.
So there's actually all sorts of different strands of sort of the Theseus legend, I suppose. And he even mentions... so he's mentioned by Hesiod, he's mentioned by Pindar, Pausanias, Euripides, Aeschylus, all sorts of people. And then Plutarch goes on to mention people that are lost to us. Yeah. Like there's a Hieros of Megara, he mentions. A guy called Demon is lost to us.
Never even heard of it.
Right. A guy called Bion.
Never
Menocrates. Yeah, all these people are lost. But the point is that the Athenians, or the Greeks, but mainly the Athenians, just wrote loads and loads and loads about him, and it seems all different people chipped in. They didn't care much about chronology, or even maybe, I don't know, but...
I feel this is something like the Marvel universe for the ancient Greeks.
That's not a bad way of thinking about it, actually. Yeah,
like these sort of, like the Marvel and DC universes.
Yeah.
That's the archetype is more important than the actual character itself and the individual. And everyone has a take on it, and you can get interesting and subversive and unusual takes on things, deliberately so, because it's about playing with the story rather than recounting history. That's the way I've always looked at it.
Yeah, that's a good way of looking at it. Absolutely. I mean, there's this type of hero that is to do with questing, that you go out and quest to become a hero. And I mean, that's very much part of the Hercules thing, the 12 tasks, the 12 labours of Hercules. And in fact, Theseus has his own 6 labours, he's sort of half of Hercules. And in fact, there's one parallel right there, is that Hercules is supposed to be he's a full demigod, isn't he? His father was Zeus, whereas Theseus's father is possibly Poseidon. So it's sort of like a lesser version.
See, I find this really interesting, because why would the Athenians need a kind of their own lesser hero? Why wouldn't they just have Hercules? Why wouldn't they just have an established hero?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think maybe I've heard some people say that, a lecturer say that that it's to do with sort of the higher 5th, 6th century classical Athens, that everyone in Greece, everyone in sort of shared Hercules to some degree.
Yeah.
And they wanted their own specifically, very, very specifically Athenian version. But they weren't prepared, or for whatever reason, didn't want to sort of outdo him.
Well, you don't want to tell an unrealistic story. Oh, you did 24 labours, did you?
Right.
As if. But so I think it's really interesting that what it might be worth reflecting on is the view of the Athenians themselves in comparison to the rest of the Greeks, and not just the rest of the Greeks either, but like everyone almost, because every city that is of any significance has, and all of the minor ones have, like their own little founding myths, as in the people came from elsewhere and were, so and so hero founded the city. Dido of Carthage, Romulus and Rome. You've got the Dorians and Sparta, but the Athenians thought of themselves as not coming from anywhere else, didn't they? They called themselves autochthonous, as if they were sprung from the soil. And Theseus doesn't bring them from somewhere else. He just gathers them together and tells them to live in a city. And so I'm not really familiar with any other ancient city that has a story like that, actually.
Yeah, that's interesting. One of the main sort of epithets that Theseus has is, I won't attempt the Greek word, but it's to be a unifier, the unifier, that that there wasn't necessarily, there weren't many people in Athens, and he sort of forced the people of Attica, that whole region, that peninsula in Greece, sort of into the city and unified them in many ways. That's sort of a big part of his character. Just to mention one last thing on the chronology is that real historians that are trying to find a real figure say that if he did exist, if there was a figure like that, it's likely to have been the 8th or 9th century BC. But that's long after Troy. We think that if the accounts in the Iliad are real, that's much earlier. That's maybe the 11th, 12th century BC. So again, the chronologies just don't match. They don't make any real sense.
But it feels very much like a cope from the Athenians to me.
A little bit.
Where it's like, well, look, we've been here since time immemorial. We don't have a story of coming elsewhere. We must have our own heroes. We must have something. And so, well, why do we all end up living in this city? Well, I have a story, you know. Who knows, you know.
And the other thing to maybe mention is that if we're going to talk about some time around 1000 BC, there's the Minoan culture, which was based in Crete. And
which is referenced.
Theseus' story is very heavily connected with Crete, and how ultimately Athens is better than Crete, right? In the end. And so you can say there's...
During the story of Theseus, Athens is paying tribute to Crete.
That's right.
So there's an inferiority complex that comes out of that.
And Theseus puts an end to it. That's part of it. So it's sort of like passing the torch on. Again, only in an allegorical way, but... Nonetheless, people have noticed that Crete goes, or the Minoan culture goes from sort of being the dominant thing in the Mediterranean to, well, Greek culture. So maybe Theseus is all part of it. I would say if anyone's interested in sort of Greek mythology, the place to start probably is Hercules. But after that, Theseus is probably... you could start there. It's a great place to start.
He's pretty wide-ranging.
Yeah, it all sort of intertwines and plays off each other, and it's all. And one last thing to say before we get stuck into the detail is that there's loads of versions. Almost everything we're going to talk about, there's more than one version of it. So in the comments, I said, "Why did you? That's not that's not what I think." Well, there will be multiple stories about it, about each thing. So it's messy. It really is.
But it's also fun. So
It's a great story, I think. The stories are really interesting, and it gives you a good insight into sort of the mind of the sort of classical Athenians, classical Greeks.
Right, where to begin?
All right, well, so to begin, one thing I would say is that it's funny, we talk about how the Athenians want a specifically Athenian story, and he's not Athenian.
No,
that's part of it. All part of his thing is that he's a foreigner. I mean, he's not from far away, but well, we'll get into it. So, his sort of the various origin stories is his father, Aegis or Aegis. I think it's Aegis. You pronounce it. His father, the king of Greece, of Athens. Big part of his story is that he was childless. His main problem was that he was childless. Of course, for any king, that's a real problem. Yeah. And his brother had 50 sons.
Right.
And so they're all looking to sort of usurp him if and when they can, when the time's right. And all Aegis wants is a son.
Yeah.
And so anyway, there's this idea for Theseus of having a dual fatherhood, that his mother is supposed to have slept with the king and on the same night have been raped by Poseidon. There's a lot of raping goes on in the ancient world, isn't there?
Yeah, there is.
In real history and in mythology. But it's not always necessarily bad. I mean, to be raped by Zeus is sort of a crime, but also like it's an honor as well on some weird level.
Probably inevitable for a lot of people.
Yeah, because I mean, Hercules' father was supposed to have been Zeus.
Yes,
and so that his mother had relations with two men on the exact same night. The whole point is that you never really know if he's a demigod or not. Where he's sort of completely human, but sort of. There's an element that he's also divine on some level. There's just that thing there, that the idea of a dual parenthood is fun. There's not many other examples of that sort of thing.
No.
But Theseus, you can say that he's partly divine on some level.
I mean, like, assuming we just take the story as it is, you've got to assume that he is in some way, because he's a great hero. He's a giant. He beats up loads of people. He kills loads of monsters. You've got to assume he is a demigod in the story's own logic.
It's part of the thing to be a great classical hero. It's a tick box. You kind of want to have some divine parentage in there if you can.
That was what made them heroic. That's what made them so much stronger or bigger than everyone else. Right? Yeah. So that was the point of it.
And one of the things that Aegis is supposed to have done is hidden a sword and some sandals under a giant stone, under a big rock. And if his son was ever to return with those, he would be able to prove it. Yeah. And so
basically, kind of like proto-sword in the stone myth.
Yeah. And even to this day, there's like a whole genre of movies that they call sword and sandal movies, and it comes from that. But yeah, so Theseus' mother is sort of he's raised outside of Athens, not that far away, still in Attica, I believe, but not actually in Athens. And apparently his parentage, whether divine or merely royal, is apparently kept from him all through his childhood until he's sort of just about old enough, or when he becomes old enough to sort of fight, grow a beard. He is told, his mother tells him that his father is in fact the king of Athens. But he shouldn't really even think of going home until he's big and strong enough to lift this rock. But Theseus is very big and strong. That's one of his things. He's extremely strong and extremely good at fighting. Yeah. So apparently with ease, he just lifts this stone, finds the sword and the sandals, and goes on his way.
Sounding very Hercules, this, isn't it?
It is. Yeah. It is. There's loads of things there that are Hercules-esque.
Yeah. Discount Hercules.
Yeah. And so one of the main sort of big episodes is his return to Athens when he's a very young man. And he could either go by sea or by land. And he apparently it was very dangerous to go by land because it's sort of invested with robbers, bandits and robbers, and
famous legendary bandits as well. But I mean, one of the things that I always think with these sorts of stories is that this is going to be some sort of reflection of a time earlier in history where the roads were particularly dangerous or something like that. Right?
Yeah.
So, go back to like 800, 900 BC. Then probably for some reason traveling on land was particularly difficult because of rogues and bandits and stuff. And Theseus does something about that, doesn't he?
Yes. So where there's the 12 labours of Hercules, he has the 6 labours of Theseus. Yeah. And they're just one after another anecdotes of him fighting bullies, basically.
Yeah.
Bandits and robbers. And you can tell it's really quite archetypal stuff because what he does is however they kill and rob and bully people, he inflicts that upon them.
Yeah.
So again, it's sort of it's a very good trait if you're looking for a king type figure or a founder figure.
Yeah, sort of
that he would
someone
do that.
Imbued with justice.
Yeah,
delivered to the villain what the villain deserves.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.